This lecture is intended to provide an overview of marketing research and a discussion of measurement and measurement theory. Let me begin by talking a little bit about my pedagogy. First, I'm using what's called a flipped class approach. A traditional approach to teaching this material would be a lecture format. You've all experienced this. You come to class, spend 50 to 60% of the class listening to a lecture, and then maybe do some discussion or group work. The discussion or group work, of course, could be one could weave that into the lecture, a few minutes here, a few minutes there. A flipped classroom takes the lecture and flips it outside of class. So you listen to this lecture outside of class, and then inside class, we go over the homework, we go over the discussion, we do group exercises, we try to apply the material, and in a face-to-face format, I get to see whether you've mastered the material, and you work with one another and learn from one another by expressing how you've learned the material and listening to your other students, your fellow students, in the way they've learned the material. I think that this is a much better approach, particularly for this kind of material, because the lectures can be understood outside of class. They don't require a great deal of interpretation. I admit that I do lose the opportunity to read you as an audience when you're listening. And so if I see puzzled looks or raised eyebrows, I can respond to those. But the kinds of questions that the kinds of questions that would occur while you're listening can be brought into the class discussion and addressed then. On the other hand, there are huge advantages, I think, in allowing you to listen to the lecture on your own time, in your own place, start and stop, repeat as necessary. So I look forward to hearing what you think of this. If you haven't encountered it before, and please give me some feedback. The flipped classroom puts much more responsibility on you to participate in class. You don't have the opportunity to come to class and sit and passively absorb or at least experience me talking. You wouldn't want that, trust me. So the classroom is almost exclusively used for you to participate. In order to get the most out of that, you need to be prepared to participate. So every week there are readings, there are assignments. Some of those assignments are designated as material that will be turned in and graded. Most of them, however, are in the form of study questions or exercises that are designed to go over in class. Please work on those ahead of time so that you're not trying to answer them in real time in class. We want to use the class experience to evaluate and discuss how you've responded to them rather than to generate your initial responses. And one final comment about my pedagogy. I'm a big believer in Bloom's taxonomy. You can see this illustrated here. Bloom was an educator who identified different levels of learning, teaching. At the bottom you see knowledge acquisition. This is the most basic form of learning, and unfortunately in far too many cases courses don't get much beyond that. Sort of rote learning of definitions and terms and facts. Above that is comprehension, which typically is attached to knowledge, so some understanding of what that information means. And then application. In most business courses, this is a primary focus. We have a more practical orientation, so we're always looking to apply what we learn. I really strive to hit the upper levels. Analysis is the ability to critique an application, or to examine a problem and identify the kinds of applications that are necessary. Synthesis is the ability to create knowledge by taking two bits of knowledge and combining them to come up with something new. And then evaluation is the ability to recognize when knowledge is good or bad, or better or worse, when applications are appropriate or inappropriate, again, or better or worse. So throughout, you and I both agree that we want to aim for higher levels of learning as the output for this course. An overview of marketing research. Marketing research is asking questions about the marketplace. So in that sense, marketing research is science. One of my favorite definitions of science is asking questions about the universe, or asking questions about reality. So marketing research is science applied to the marketplace and all the factors of the marketplace. You might be asking questions about the macro environment, so forecasting economic conditions, or for predicting new regulations, trying to estimate what social factors will be important, trends, fashions, etc. Gathering information about consumers, how they decide, what they think is important, what they believe, what they do. Collecting information about suppliers, trying to estimate the behavior of suppliers. And of course, gathering information about competitors, competitive intelligence, competitive information. The motivating factors, why marketing research is necessary and important, I think fall into two broad categories. The first is the marketing concept. Marketing concept is a name applied to a philosophy of business or a business strategy that underlies the discipline of marketing, and that is that the firm should take its direction from an understanding of what consumers want and need, and try to be profitable by satisfying those wants and needs. And obviously, if that is the underlying philosophy of the firm, then it behooves the firm to understand those wants and needs. And that's a very central and fundamental and crucial philosophy about business, that the sense that you are competing with other firms to deliver better satisfaction and better value. And of course, satisfaction includes value. Satisfaction includes price. It's sort of getting what you want in terms of satisfaction at the lowest price, or at the lowest total cost. So the ability to deliver that means that you have to understand that consumers are driving the market. They're making all these free choices out there, and whether your firm is going to be successful depends on whether you are delivering the goods. And you can deliver the goods accidentally, or you can deliver the goods because you have some intuitive understanding of what people want, or you can deliver the goods because you've done a good job of proactively understanding what the marketplace wants and proactively understanding how you can do it better than your competitors. And that last point leads to the second motivating factor, and that is strategic competitive advantage. Firms gain competitive advantage because they deliver satisfaction better than their competitors. We sometimes talk about the 3 Ds of strategy. A firm needs to offer something that's desirable. Well, you need to understand what consumers want if you're going to offer something that's desirable. A firm is successful strategically if what it offers is different. You're not going to be very successful in most markets if you offer a completely me too product. If you only offer what the competitors are offering, then at best, you're going to share the market with those competitors. And finally, you need to offer something that's desirable and different and defensible. Your advantage must be defensible over some period of time. That's why firms rarely are successful by instituting short-term price cuts, because it's very easy for competitors to match those price cuts, and they will if they're forced to. So coming up with some more with an advantage that can be patented, or an advantage that comes from some scarce resource, tying up a supplier in a long-term contract, or hiring the very best talent so that your competitors can't match it, or coming up with some strategy that's integrated and complicated, such as Nordstrom has or Starbucks has, that's where customer service is, we know that's the advantage, but competitors simply don't know how to copy it or imitate it. And to have those characteristics of desirability, desirability, differentiation, and defensibility means that you have to have information about the marketplace, information about consumers, information about suppliers, information about competitors, information about the environment. And that's where marketing research comes in. We deal with research in various roles. Although this is a business course, most of the time we'll be talking about the way we conduct or use research on the job. I think it's important to be aware of how we use research outside the job, in our roles as citizens. For example, we have to respond to persuasive attempts that are supported by research from politicians, from policymakers, from various advocacy groups, and the opinions we hold and the votes that we cast and the politicians that we support and the policies that we support are affected by our evaluation of that research. And as family members and friends, again, we deal with proposals that are supported by research. Not always formal research, sometimes it's informal research, but it behooves us to be able to respond intelligently and I'll use the word scientifically, to better our lives and to sort of increase the chances for good outcomes in our lives. On the job, we can think about research roles falling into 2 categories. One is as consumers of research, people who use research, and most people in management, mid-level management and upper-level management, with the exception of the few specialties, directors of marketing research, for example, are going to be users or consumers of research. And then the other role is, of course, producers of research. But let me talk about the first one, consumers of research now. Consumers of research have at least 3 ways that they're engaged in research. The first is not only first on my list, but first chronologically. The users of research should be involved in shaping research. It's management that knows what needs to be done, knows what the problems are, knows what the applications are likely to be, and so they play an important role in the early stages of designing research. When we talk about research design next week, we'll make the point repeatedly that no matter how well designed the research is, if it's off target, it has the potential to be a complete waste if it's simply not addressing the important question. And so that is an important role for management to play in clarifying the initial research question to assure that the research addresses that question. Then management comes back into play. So the manager and the researcher are kind of like the consumer and the contractor who is redesigning or remodeling your kitchen. As the homeowner, you decide, it's ultimately up to you what the kitchen should look like. And the contractor may have some ideas along those lines, but it's ultimately your decision because you're the one that knows what the final design should be. And then once you establish that, it's the contractor's job to actually install the cabinets and the sink, the appliances and the counters and such, and finish the job. So management knows what problems need to be solved, and then sort of hands that positioning or that guidance off to the researcher, whose job it is to execute the research. And once that research is executed, management comes back into play in interpreting the research results. Now, as we'll see when we as we go along, it's actually the researcher who is interpreting research results, but management needs to cast a skeptical eye upon those interpretations and needs to have a fairly sophisticated understanding of how research is done so as not to be misled by incorrect interpretations. So that's why we will look at fairly closely at some of the mathematics of analysis and some of the subtleties of research designs so that we can be good interpreters of research results. And finally, it's almost exclusively the role of management or the consumers of research to see the application of research, see how this should modify marketing practice, for example. Now let me give you an example of each of those three. The interaction to shape research results. So MBA enrollments have been in decline for the last 5 years, and every school is trying to deal with that. So that's the general management problem for an MBA director, that enrollments are in decline. So if you are the MBA director for Seattle University, then the question is, well, what research should be done to determine why enrollments are in decline, or what research should be done to determine how best to respond to that? If you decide that it's some sort of environmental trend, some things that are beyond your control are reducing enrollment because overall enrollment nationally is down. How can you best defend against that problem and maintain or increase enrollment in your own school? So then your role as management would be to decide, what do we need to know? And what do we need to ask people? If we're going to contact people and ask them to answer questions, what form? Should we be doing a focus group? Should we be doing a survey? Should we be doing some sort of experiment? And then who should we ask? A very easy suggestion is to do a survey of our students. Well, an obvious problem with that is that our students have already decided to come here. And one could argue that we should be talking to the people who decided not to come here. So that involvement in the very beginning to shape the kind of research is crucial. A classic example of misinterpreting research results is the famous New Coke introduction in the 80s, when Coca-Cola modified its formula and introduced it, and there was a tremendous negative consumer response, and this backlash cut sales, opened the door for Pepsi, and Pepsi gained market share as a result that they didn't lose for decades, and also forced Coca-Cola to develop a couple of new products, the classic Coke response, which was, I don't know what the total cost was, but hundreds of millions of dollars. Now, the problem there was not that they didn't do marketing research. In fact, they did tons of marketing research. They were very confident on the basis of that research that the new formula resulted in a product that people preferred to the old formula. So New Coke tasted better than old Coke. The problem was that all of that research had been done in blind taste tests. So people were asked to taste 2 cola drinks, and they had no labels on either cola drink. And the New Coke formula consistently outperformed the old Coke formula. Well, one should have interpreted from that people had a preference for that taste over the other taste. But what Coca-Cola presumed from the research was that they could launch the new formula and tell people it was a new formula, and they would be better off. And there is a significant difference between a blind taste test and a branded taste test. And marketers have always known that, but Coca-Cola people simply weren't thinking about it. So when Coca-Cola announced that they had changed the formula, people responded very negatively to that fact. They weren't responding to the flavor. They were responding to the action that Coca-Cola had taken to change their very much admired and appreciated brand without consulting them. So there was kind of an ownership that consumers felt toward the brand, and Coca-Cola was violating that sense of ownership. And in fact, the taste test results had very little to do with this change in formula strategy that became public. And finally, the application of research results. And my example here is one that's very, very common. I would say maybe the most common problem in marketing research, and that is the application of focus group results, the misapplication of focus group results. The film industry is infamous for using focus groups to make decisions about how to market and even modify films. So they will screen a film in a private screening and recruit a dozen people from the audience and have them talk about the film afterwards in a focus group. We'll talk about focus groups next week. And on the basis of that, they'll make decisions about how to promote the film, or maybe even how to re-edit the film. So they may even, in some cases, they change the endings of films, or they de-emphasize one character in a film, or otherwise change the storyline. And as we'll point out, that's a totally inappropriate use of focus groups. It's inappropriate to generalize the overall attitudinal or affective response of a focus group to a large audience for a variety of reasons. The other major role of research is as a producer of research. So this is the other member of the dyad, person who's actually conducting research. And most of the course, we're going to be talking about the nuts and bolts of research production. So here, let me just talk about a couple of overarching concerns of the producers of research. The first is to identify the research goals in a very general sense. Now, obviously, identifying the research question is relevant to identifying the research goals, but here I'm talking about whether it's theory-based or effects-based, whether it's basic or applied. So a much higher level kind of decision about that will affect the more specific decisions about research design, etc. So research can be categorized as either theory-based or effects-based. And much of the discussion or controversy or argument about specific research or the value of research in general is related to this distinction. A theory, a very simple definition of a theory, is a generalized relationship among constructs, with the twin emphases on generalization. So it's a relationship that's generalized. It applies, in fact, a theory must apply to every instance that qualifies as the constructs in question. And constructs, we'll talk in a few minutes. I'll talk in a few minutes about what a construct is, but basically it's, again, a general definition rather than a specific instance. So, for example, the statement, "My car is green," is a relationship between two elements, car and the color green. But since it's my car, that's a very specific element. And green is not a very abstract construct. So the statement, "My car is green," doesn't really qualify as a theory. On the other hand, if you were to say that durable products and cars, especially cars, communicate status. Again, you have two elements, cars, or maybe three if you include the superset durable products, and status. And I suppose you could even argue that communicates is a separate construct, but it's a small set, but they're far more generalizable. You're trying to make a statement, in this case, applies to all, not just to my car, but to all cars and even to all durable products. And you're not saying that they communicate anything specific, such as the color green, but they communicate something more general and more complex that you're calling status. And that would qualify as a theory. So theory-based research has the goal of providing evidence relevant to that theory. Specifically, generally it's a test of that theory. It's some opportunity for that theory to fail. Now, theory-based research, because that's the goal, implies things about, has implications for the design of the research. For example, theory-based research typically leads to experimentation rather than more descriptive kinds of research. Typically requires samples of people who are similar to one another rather than different from one another, and often requires more sophisticated forms of analysis with lots of control measures. So let me contrast that with effects-based research. Effects-based research aims to predict a specific outcome, a specific size and direction of a relationship among operationalizations. So we haven't defined operationalization, but an operationalization will be defined momentarily as something that you do or some specific measurement that you make. So effects now are looking at specific but precise relationships, and the relationships are not among constructs but among specific operationalizations. So theory is looking at sort of the direction of relationships among general constructs, and effects tests are looking at the specific size and direction of relationships among things that are actually done, operationalizations. So you might say that price increases decrease sales. That's a pretty straightforward economics theory from economics. You might contrast that with this statement that a 50-cent off coupon for Campbell's tomato soup at QFC stores will result in a 5% increase in units sold over a period of 3 days. So the former is a theory statement and the latter is an effects statement. So you can imagine that QFC management could be more interested in either of those in different situations for sort of long-term practice and general understanding of the marketplace. They obviously would like to be assured that a price decrease will increase unit sales. But for a specific promotion, that is the proposed 50-cent off coupon on Campbell's tomato soup, they'd like to be assured that they will break even or that they will make a certain level of profit or whatever the result of that 5% increase in unit sales is for 3 days. So both theory tests and effects tests have their uses. They're both valuable. The problem comes when we're sloppy or wrong about what the objective is when we design the research. Now, the distinction between basic and applied is not quite the same as the difference between theory and effect, although basic research usually is theory-based research and applied research usually is effects-based research. There are cases where that's not the case. One can do basic research that is case-based, where you're trying to establish what happens in a given situation, and you do look at specific outcomes in response to specific operationalizations. And many times firms will do applied research that's fairly well grounded in theory. But typically, basic research is more scholarly research, is more the kind of research that faculty members do. And applied research is most often, applied is the kind of research that businesses most often do, because businesses typically are not interested in solving problems for the long run. And one could argue that they should be, but typically they're not. Typically they're dealing with problems as they come up, and they want specific solutions that will be applicable to those problems. And so they end up doing applied research. Now, I said that those different goals had important implications for how the research was designed. I mentioned the sample. Let me elaborate on that. In theory-based research, so I'm doing theory-based research now on the effects of what I'm calling marketing benchmarks. Benchmark is when an advertisement tells the consumer how much to spend on a product, or how often to replace a product or how much to buy of a product. An oil change is a very common example that we're all familiar with. Most oil change companies tell consumers to change their oil every 3,000 miles. Now, these instances are interesting because benchmarks are interesting when consumers don't know. So consumers don't know how often they should change their oil. They can't judge when oil is worn out, when the engine's being damaged, and so on. And so there's a tendency to rely on what marketers tell us to do. So my interest is in whether consumers believe these things and when they work and why they work and so on. Now, because I'm interested in the theory, I should conduct my research tests on let me use air quotes here, college sophomores. It's appropriate for me to do experiments on college sophomores, even though college sophomores are only a very small segment of the buying market for oil changes, for example, because I'm interested in the relationship between the benchmark and the response. Whether people, my dependent measure tends to be, I call subjective benchmark. It's what people think they ought to do. So the ad is telling me I ought to change every 3,000 miles. So my question is, how often do you think you should change? So I'm interested in the effect of what's of the benchmark in the ad on these people's perceptions of what they ought to do. And I don't want anything else to affect that. I don't want age to affect it. I don't want income to affect it. I don't want different levels of product experience or expertise to affect it. And so college sophomores are a good sample for me because they tend to be homogeneous. People in a set of college sophomores tend to be very much alike. So I can eliminate all those differences that might be relevant. Now, I'm not saying that age and product experience and income don't matter. Of course they matter, and that might be interesting research to conduct. But the theory needs to be tested in a very controlled step-by-step fashion. So an appropriate sample is to try to eliminate all the other factors and just look at the thing that's being manipulated. If I were an advertiser, on the other hand, and I wanted to know whether an ad with a benchmark worked, I don't want to use college sophomores unless that is exactly my target market. If I'm an oil change company, I want to have a sample of people that are like my customers. And that would be all age groups, a variety of income levels, a variety of education levels, some getting their first oil change, some people getting their 100th oil change, so lots of product experiences, because I want results in my study to be good predictors of what happens in the marketplace. And in the marketplace, my customers are widely variant. So they're not a homogeneous group. So whether it's theory test based or effects based in its objective, the research should have very different samples that would be appropriate ultimately. Okay, the other general issue for research roles is scientific method. And again, scientific method, I think, has to do with you as an individual as well as you as a business person. And one of my sincere goals in this course is to improve everybody's ability to use the scientific method in thinking. So, what is the scientific method? Well, it's been applied to two ways of learning. Scientific method is a way of learning or using knowledge to expand our knowledge. The two ways are inductive and deductive. Inductive is a more passive way of learning. Inductive is making observations of specific phenomena and accruing those observations. It involves categorizing, so you observe something, and then you're able to categorize that thing. So let's say you observe a tree in the forest, and you're able to identify what that tree is, at least in your own mind, so that the next time you see a tree that you think is the same, your ability to recognize it or categorize it, excuse me, as another example of that tree or not. And once a number of these observations have been made, to be able to draw some conclusion about them. So you might, for example, after a number of hikes, conclude that a certain variety of tree tends to grow on the sun-facing slopes and not on the shade-facing slopes. That's an example of inductive logic or inductive learning. So it's passive in the sense that these observations may occur without much. They just occur by chance as you go through life, although it can be more proactive. You can sort of seek out these observations, and that's what businesses often will do. Deductive is a more proactive way of learning. Deductive, rather than inductive. So inductive ends with this generalization. Deductive learning begins with a generalization, a proposed generalization. So you simply might propose and say, well, broad-leafed trees tend to grow on the shady side of the slope more often than the sunny side of the slope. And you might have some reason for thinking that. You might think that, well, because they have broad leaves, they're better at collecting the limited sunlight that falls on the shady side of the slope. And then you follow that generalization with specific observations, but these observations are not made passively, they're made actively. So you design these observations, and they're called falsification tests in formal logic. So you design an observation, which might be an experiment, or it might be simply a correlational measurement, but it's intended to represent something of relevance to your generalization. So you, after making the proposal that the broadleaf trees grow on the sunny side of the slope, you say, okay, I'm going to hike, make 10 hikes, 5 on the sunny side and 5 on the shady side, and count the number of the proportion of broadleaf trees that I see. And that will be a test of my general statement. And if the statement is supported by the evidence in those, then you maintain your belief in the truth of the statement. And if the specific tests contradict the statement, then you need to modify the statement. So you might find that certain kinds of broadleaf trees do grow on the sunny side, but others don't. And so then your theory becomes more precise, and your general statement then is broadleaf trees of such and such kind tend to grow on the shady sides, and others grow equally well or even better on the sunny side. So inductive starts with a series of observations and then comes to a general conclusion that one might call theory. Deductive starts with a theory which has some logical relationship among the constructs, some reason for thinking that it's true, and then and that relationship is then tested through these specific observations and modified as necessary. And then the cycle continues in deductive. The modified theory then could be tested further, and the whole process of science is to make these theories stronger and stronger by making them typically more specific. And a good example of this, if you're a baseball fan, we're seeing right now this year an unprecedented number of shifts, defensive shifts in response to hitters. And baseball is a notoriously slow to change institution. Um, and so you look at these shifts now and say, gee, why have they been playing for 150 years without doing this? Well, in fact, they have shifted in the past, but not to the extent that they probably should have. And these shifts have come about through an inductive process. All of the justifications for shifting for, say, Manny Ortiz of the Boston Red Sox. So when he comes to bat, instead of the typical alignment with a first baseman and a second baseman on the right side and a shortstop and a third baseman on the left side, he's a left-handed hitter. They pull one of those infielders from the left over to the right, so he's looking at three infielders that are squarely on the right side, and the fourth infielder is actually out near second base, and nobody is on the left side. Well, why have managers done that? Well, they've observed time and time again that when Manny Ortiz bats, he pulls the ball to the right side. So ground balls are hit to the right side off his bat. They saw it again, they saw it again, they saw it again. And finally somebody sort of said, gee, we've seen him bat an awful lot of times, and looks like 80% of the time he pulls the ball to the right side. Maybe we should shift our defense that way. Okay, that's fine. I think they've reached an appropriate conclusion, but they could have reached that same conclusion deductively. They could have said, gee, Manny Ortiz is a big, powerful, left-handed hitter. He's swinging really hard, and he's very strong. It stands to reason that he's going to pull the ball to the right side. Let's do an experiment. Let's get big, strong left-handed batters, let's say 6 or 8 of them, and have each of them bat 100 times. And every other time we'll shift the defense, and every other time we'll use the standard defense. And we'll just keep track of how many hits they get each way, and then we'll compare them. And after doing that, you would either support the theory that big left-handed power hitters pull the ball or not support it. And I think you would probably come to the same conclusion. The difference, again, is that the deductive approach is proactive. You've thought about the problem, come up with a proposed theoretical relationship, and tested it, rather than sort of sat around and waited to see what would happen. And you see this in business all the time. Restaurateurs, retailers. If you go to a restaurateur or a retailer early on and say, what's your best-selling product? What's your best-selling item on the menu? They'll say, I don't know. Give me a few months and then I'll tell you. So they are implicitly relying on an inductive learning process. They're going to wait and make a bunch of observations and then tell you. They could experiment. They could test various products in various places, various items at various times, and reach the same conclusions. So both of these processes are scientific. One is more passive, one is more proactive. Again, businesses do both. An awful lot of information in business comes from inductive processes. For scholars do both too. A lot of research tends to be sort of summaries of what's happened and drawing insights from those what's happened. Case-based research is kind of inductive research. We'll talk about that later. Theory-based research tends to be more deductive. Okay, final comment is this idea of concepts versus operationalizations. I've mentioned both already. Concepts exist at the level of ideas. So concepts are generalized definitions. I mentioned status was a concept. Durable products is a concept. Operationalizations exist in the real world. So operationalizations are instances of concepts. So a BMW is an instance of a status, high status, non-durable. And a Kia is an instance of a low status, non-durable. $1.99 is an instance of a high price for tomato soup, and 79 cents is an instance of a low price. So high price and low price are concepts. 79 cents and $1.99 are operationalization of that. There is a fairly standard or generalizable framework for doing research, or a process for conducting research. It begins with identification of the problems and questions involved. So the first step is to identify the management problem. And then that management problem is translated into typically more than one research problem or specific research questions. Now, the distinction between those two is important. The management problem is usually developed or identified by management. Management tends to take a short-term view and tends to focus on proximal variables, that is, variables that are immediately relevant and close to them. Things like profitability, sales, market share, number of transactions, so on. As the text points out, often those issues are just the tip of the iceberg. They're up above the waterline, they're visible to management, but they're not the causes, and they don't lend themselves to research because there aren't any measures that map very closely onto those variables. So the job of the research personnel, the research team, is to work with management to identify specific research questions that are relevant to the causes of those important effects. What causes profitability to go down? What causes sales to be inadequate? What causes consumer dissatisfaction, and so on? And that's a crucial interaction, because if researchers don't come up with the right question, then doing all the rest of the steps well is moot, because the conclusions that one reaches may not have much relevance to the problem that management perceives. Okay, and the third step, once researchers feel comfortable that they've analyzed the situation and identified the appropriate research questions, is to ask the question, what do we know already? What do we know that's relevant to this research problem? And that means conducting literature review, gathering secondary data and looking at that secondary data, deciding how relevant the secondary data are. Secondary data may be research that other people have done. It may be research that the firm has done in the past. But you always want to be sensitive to the notion that you don't want to reinvent the wheel. You don't want to conduct research if you can make a good decision based on what is already knowable. As that secondary data is analyzed, the researcher then develops a conceptual model. Now, a conceptual model is a theory that applies to the situation. It's a sense of what constructs are causes and what constructs are effects. So if the effect in question is sales, then of course the 4 P's are possible causes. And more specific levels of those 4 P's will be relevant in any one situation. And it's only after that conceptual model is identified that the researcher knows what variables to look at and how to measure those variables. So for example, in those first 4 steps, imagine that management has identified a problem as satisfaction is not as high as they would like. So they think their customers are dissatisfied. Well, conceptually, we know that satisfaction is a function of expectations versus performance. Expectations are a function of what we know about consumer behavior, sort of a macro environmental approach, and what we think consumers gather from what the firm is saying, mostly from promotion and packaging information. So we've got some macro environmental issues to investigate and some understanding of the 4 Ps that are involved. And secondary research might show that, for example, price is adequate or competitive, that product quality is quite good, that distribution exceeds expectations, and that might suggest then that the appropriate conceptual model here, or the appropriate specific question, has to do with promotion. And so researchers might come up with a fairly specific hypothesis that this dissatisfaction is a function of salesperson performance or customer service at the point of purchase, for example. And given that fairly specific question, then the researcher can say, well, if that's the researchable problem, then we need to measure these specific variables, and this is how we're going to measure those variables. And that in turn leads to the next step, which is to develop the research design. So once the researcher knows what variables are going to be measured and how, then, and again, knowing what the conceptual model is, he knows whether it's going to be a focus group or a survey or an experiment, and what type of each of those might be. And then the next steps are fairly straightforward. Given the design, who's going to supply the information? That's the sample. Then collecting the data, then analyzing the data, and finally interpreting the analysis, drawing conclusions. There are conclusions both about the analysis and the application of those results, and then providing those in the form of a report, written or oral. Four major categories of research. The first is a literature review. And again, I specified that this was an important first step in conducting research, finding out what's already known that's relevant to the problem. You never want to reinvent the wheel. Most research questions have been addressed. The question, as I said before, is whether they were addressed in a way that's sufficiently similar to the current problem that those conclusions can be used rather than conducting new research. And there are many dimensions that affect that similarity issue. Was that research similar enough to a certain current condition? The products, the place, the time, even a company's own research. So the same company, the same target market, the same products, the same research question, if it was conducted long enough ago, the old research might not be relevant to the new problem simply because the world has changed. And that target market is now different, or the economic conditions are different, or competitors have changed. So one must consider a variety of dimensions when doing literature review, but even if the research is not useful in the sense that it makes the need to eliminates the need to conduct new research, it still helps you to frame the current research, helps to identify the kinds of variables that might need to be measured or how to measure them. Often researchers will simply borrow measures that have been used before because they've been demonstrated to be reasonably reliable and they're standardized, so you can make comparisons across research studies and so on. First category, beyond literature review, is exploratory research. And often in a research often a research project can be divided into steps, and exploratory research is the first step because the purpose of exploratory research is to help to frame the problem. If the management problem, for example, is that sales are down, and the researcher decides that there's been an erosion of brand equity, well, that's a pretty general problem. There are lots of reasons why the brand may have lost value, and one cannot simply push ahead with a survey and start measuring things without deciding what the reasons are that the brand has lost value. So exploratory research would help to identify what the appropriate variables are and what language to use. How do you talk to other firms, or how do you talk to consumers so that they understand what you're talking about? If you want to talk about attributes of your product, what are the words that they use? How do they think about those attributes so that when you write a question, their response is appropriate to the question that you're trying to ask. Second category is descriptive research. Descriptive research answers the question, what's happening? What's going on? What are people doing? What do people think? What do they feel? What do they intend to do? What are people's brand attitudes? What are the various market shares? What have they been buying? And what are the characteristics of these people? Are these, what are their ages? What are their occupations? Where do they live? Which firms are they buying from? Which products are they buying? Which products do they think about? Where do they get information? So any research that essentially takes a picture of what's going on is describing the marketplace. And clearly, in order to do descriptive research, you have to have answered the questions that exploratory research addresses, because you have to know what the variables of interest are. You have to know the language that is useful. You have to know what to measure. And the third category is causal research. Causal research addresses the question of why and how. So it presumes that there is a what. You know what might be happening. And now the question is, why is it happening? Why are people buying this brand? Why do people have a positive attitude toward this product? How is that attitude influenced by various forms of advertising? How would a change in salesperson preparation affect people's intention to buy? The final topic of this first lecture is measurement. Measurement is the relationship between constructs and indicators. And constructs and indicators, that dichotomy is analogous to concepts and operationalizations in the sense that constructs and concepts are ideas or generalizations, and operationalizations and indicators are real-world phenomena. So measurement is an indication of a construct. It's a reflection of a construct. Weight, for example, is a construct. It's an idea that reflects mass, and a number of pounds is an indicator of weight. So I weigh 160 pounds. So that number 160 with the unit pounds is an indication of my weight. I also weigh 10.7 stone. So 10.7 stone is another indicator of my weight. Now, I haven't done the math, but I weigh a certain number of kilograms, 72 or so. So these are different measures of the same construct. Now, stones, kilograms, and pounds can be related fairly specifically and accurately so that we can come up with a measure in each of those units that is pretty precisely equivalent to a different number in one of the other units. But there are other indicators of constructs that aren't in such good agreement. For example, the number of inches tall I am might be used as an indicator of what I weigh. And most of us would agree that that's not a very good indicator. Turns out that height and weight are positively correlated, but we know from casual observation that there are tall, thin people, and there are tall, fat people, and there are short, thin people, and short, fat people. And so we shouldn't expect height and weight to be perfectly correlated, and we shouldn't expect number of inches tall to be a very precise indicator of how much a person weighs. Now, if that's true in the hard sciences, it's especially true in social sciences, such as marketing, where we have many indicators of interesting and useful constructs, and they don't always agree. So one of the tasks in research is to try to assess those measures, compare them with other measures, and think carefully about how much we want to rely on them. One of the crucial constructs we'll be talking about is attitude. Attitude is sort of the overall evaluation. And if we talk about brand attitude, we're talking about how good or bad, how positive or negative consumers feel about a brand. Well, how do we measure that? Well, there are lots of ways to measure it, and they don't all measure exactly the same thing. So that gets to this next bullet point here, the measurement equation. The measured score has three components: the true score, bias, and error. So we have this notion that there is a true score. If we're talking about my height, that I am really a true number of inches tall. Now with height, we can probably get pretty good agreement about what that true score is. And so if we're using, depending on what type of measurement instrument we're using, we may not have much bias or error. But if we measured me with a ruler, a 12-inch stick, it's likely that there would be significant bias or error. Bias, and it's important to recognize the distinction. So bias is a constant deviation from a true score. So if we had a stick that was in truth 12.1 inches long, and we thought it was 12 inches long, then we would be consistently measuring, have a consistent bias of 1/10 of an inch for every foot that we measured, right? So we would be underestimating my height. I don't want you to use that stick. Error is a random deviation. Now, our wooden stick will expand and contract due to heat, the temperature, and the humidity of its environment. And assuming that temperature and humidity are uncontrollable, they're not necessarily random, those deviations are going to contribute to error. So it would be error in the sense that we don't know which direction they're going to go in. So if we didn't know the temperature and the humidity at the time of the measurement, then we wouldn't know whether they had expanded or contracted the ruler. And again, in social sciences, those deviations tend to be larger and less controllable than they do in the hard sciences. So we're going to have often have scores where we assume that there is some true score underneath, but the way the measure was taken introduces some bias or some error. Validity and reliability are characteristics of measures that we often use to discuss the strength of the measure, the usefulness of the measure. Validity is the extent to which the measure truly represents the construct. So in essence, a valid score is one that has zero bias and zero error. The measured score equals the true score. Reliability is the repeatability of a measure. So a reliable measure is one where the measured score, when it's repeated on the same phenomenon, the same item, the same situation. So if you're measuring people, for example, if you measure the same people in essentially the same context or situation, you'll get the same score. So a reliable score is one that has no error. It may have bias, but remember, bias is a constant deviation. It's that tenth of an inch difference in the ruler. So if we measure me with that ruler that is in fact 12.1 inches, we'll get a wrong score for my height, but every time we measure me with that same stick, we'll get the same score. So it would be a reliable score. Well, the concern for reliability and validity kind of depends on the objective of the measurement. In marketing and in most social sciences, reliable scores are sufficient. It's so difficult to get rid of error terms that let me back off that. It's so difficult to know or to get rid of bias that we tend to focus on the error term and content ourselves with measures that have low error. Now, it's not that we are saying that validity isn't important, but in many contexts it has limited importance. And most of those contexts are when the true score is essentially unknowable, but it's not really crucial that we know the true score. Let me go back to attitude as an example. We presume that consumers have attitudes toward brands and that they, other things being equal, tend to make purchases that are consistent with their attitudes. So if you think of colas, people like Coca-Cola a certain amount, they like Pepsi a certain amount, they like other brands of cola a certain amount, and they tend to buy the one that they like the most. So that's an example of people behaving consistently with their attitudes. So if we wanted to understand purchase or predict purchase, one way to do it would be to measure attitudes. So we assume that people have these attitudes and that those attitudes have a true score. And let's say we're measuring attitude on some sort of scale that runs from 1 to 10. And I measure one person's attitude and it's a 7. Well, is that the true score? Well, in this context, it doesn't really mean anything to say that his true score is 7 on this 10-point scale. The only thing that matters really is the relative score. So what's his score toward Coke and what's his score toward Pepsi? If he has a 7 attitude toward Coke and only a 5 toward Pepsi, assuming that higher numbers are more positive, then we would predict that he would prefer Coke to Pepsi. So we don't really care whether 7 captures the true level of his attitude, just care that 7 is higher than 5, and so 7 is relatively more positive than 5. So there may be some bias in there, but we're not so concerned about the bias. If we could eliminate error and show that every time we measure his score, it's higher for Coke than it is for Pepsi, then for most marketing applications, we would be comfortable with that. Now, there are other situations where we do have a sense that there's an absolute score that's important. For example, in purchase predictions. How likely are you to buy Coca-Cola this week? There's a yes answer and a no answer, and by the end of the week, we'll know whether or not you purchased. So in that case, we would like to eliminate bias as well as error. I don't want to have a measurement in which, let's say I'm measuring likelihood of purchase from 0 to 100%, and people score 80% for Coke and 70% for Pepsi. And since both of those are very close to 100%, I predict that they'll buy both Coke and Pepsi. Well, it may be that more people buy Coke than Pepsi, but only 20% of the people buy either of them. So in that case, I've got a strong bias that inflates both those scores up, toward the 100% end of the scale. But if my goal is to make predictions about behavior, the bias tends to be important in that case. So again, we need to think about the application of the research. Are we going to just be making relative comparisons? In that case, what we need is a good, reliable measure. Or are we going to be making specific outcomes predictions? In that case, we may need valid measures. External validity and internal validity are terms that will come up particularly in experiments, but also in questionnaires, surveys. External validity is used to describe the ability of, this has less to do with the measure than the sort of research design. But they come up here because the term validity is used. External validity has to do with the confidence with which you can generalize the measure or the effects outside the study. And internal validity refers to the extent to which you can generalize the effects inside the study. So external validity has more to do with effects tests, whether what happens in the study reflects what will happen in the marketplace. And internal validity has more to do with the logic of the study. Did this effect result from the construct that was measured or the construct that was manipulated? So again, internal validity more important for a theory test where you're really interested in the logical relationship among the constructs, and external validity more relevant to an effects test where you want to generalize a specific outcome from the study to another situation, usually the marketplace. One final comment about measurement that is crucial in marketing research, and that is levels of measurement. There are 4 levels of measurement, and these levels imply different kinds of interpretation from the measures, and they further imply different sorts of analysis of the measurement data. The 4 levels are nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio, all of which are discussed in the textbook. Nominal, which means name, nominal measurements are simply defined categories. So states. What state is a person from? I'm from Washington, you're from Oregon, she's from California, those people over there are from Ohio. The state names identify different categories. brand names are nominal measures. This product's from Coca-Cola, that product's from Nike, that product's from Microsoft. Numbers can be nominal. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's say that I have 5 versions of a new product that I'm considering introducing, and I do a taste test, and I have each person taste each of the 5, and I label the 5 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So I just have the number 0 on one of the products, the number 1 on one of the products, and then I compare my sample's stated preferences for the 5, and I say, gee, it looks like they liked version 2 better than version 3, but they liked version 1 most of all. So numbers can be used as names. That's the lowest level of measurement, naming things and assigning categories according to those names. Second is ordinal. Ordinal implies order. So ordinal is a set of categories because it too is a set of names, but those categories have an implied order. So small, medium, and large. Small is the name of a category, medium is the name of a category, and large is the name of a category. But the implication is that medium has more of something than small does. Usually it's more volume or more mass. And large has even more of that dimension than does medium. Well, numbers, of course, imply order as well. And in fact, the numbers are ordinal numbers. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, there's an implication that 4 has more of whatever you're reflecting than does 3, and 3 has more than 2. So if you're looking at, if you're measuring the speed at which people can run around a racetrack, and you say that this horse finished first, and that horse finished second, and this horse over there finished third, then the numbers 1, 2, 3 imply the order in which they finished the race. The third level is interval. Interval measures identify a category, each identifies a category of responses that has a name, and the categories fall along a dimension in order, plus the distances between the categories are equal, so equal intervals. So inches, if I measure something, the length of a notebook in inches, and say it's 7 inches or 8 inches or 9 inches, or 10 inches or 11 inches, then I have an interval measure of length, because not only is the 8-inch tablet a different category than from the 7-inch category, but the 8-inch category is in fact bigger than the 7-inch category, and the 8-inch category is exactly the same amount bigger than the 7-inch category as the 9-inch category is bigger than the 8-inch category. So in each case, the gap between 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 is 1 inch. It's exactly the same 1 inch for all of them. Now notice that's not true of the order of finish in the race. The first place horse might finish only half a second in front of the second place horse, but the second place horse may finish 4 seconds in front of the third place horse. So the intervals between first and second and third need not be the same. And finally, ratio. The highest level of measurement is a ratio scale. A ratio scale has categories that are names and imply an order and have equal intervals and have a meaningful 0 point. A meaningful 0 point means that you can divide scores. So let's take dollars, for example. I can measure the dollars of income and say that a person makes from $0 per year up to $500,000 per year. And so my scale runs from 0 to 500,000 in units of $1. So I've got 501,000 points on my scale. And I know that somebody who makes $20,000 a year is different from somebody who makes $10,000, right? So those are two different categories. They're two different names. And I know that the person who makes $20,000 actually makes more money than the person who's measured at $10,000. And I know that the difference between 20,000 and 10,000, which is 10,000, is the same as the difference between 30,000 and 20,000, or 170,000 and 160,000. So those are equal intervals of the same size. Plus, because there's a meaningful 0 point, that is that 0 means $0 and not just the end of the scale, I can say that somebody who makes $100,000 makes twice as much as somebody who makes $50,000. Or somebody who makes $40,000 is making half as much as somebody who makes $80,000. So I can multiply and divide. By contrast, if I were measuring attitude on that 10-point scale that I mentioned earlier, I know that the different, well, this is kind of dicey. We presume actually that a 10-point attitude scale is an interval scale, that the difference between an attitude of 9 and an attitude of 8, which is 1 unit, is the same as the difference, same size as the difference between 8 and 7 or 3 and 2. We do not presume, however, that 0 is a meaningful 0 point. So we would never try to infer that somebody who has a score of 6 is twice as positive as somebody who has a score of 3. All right, the distinction in levels of measurement is crucial between ordinal and interval. Most of the analyses we do are the same for nominal and ordinal measures, and they're the same for interval and ratio measures, but they're not the same. The analysis of ordinal data is not the same as the analysis of interval data. And that will become clear once we get into those types of analysis.